Imagine just a small group of friends, really, but friends who fundamentally shaped the world we actually live in today.
Navigating these huge global crises, defining an entire era. It's quite something.
Exactly. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into this incredible stack of sources about the wise men.
Right.
These 6 really influential figures who guided American foreign policy, through the whole mid-20th century.
Yeah, we're talking about 2 bankers, W. Averell Harriman, Robert Lovett.
2 lawyers as well.
2 lawyers, Dean Acheson and John J. McCloy. And then the diplomats.
George F. Kennan and Charles E. Chip Bohlen.
Chip Bohlen, yeah. That's the group.
So our mission here is to unpack their unique blend of backgrounds, their shared values, these sort of pragmatic approaches they had that really defined America's stance on the world for decades. We want to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. Okay, let's get into it. We're talking about a group that basically forged the American post-war foreign policy establishment.
Pretty much, yeah.
So who were these wise men, and what was the defining essence that united them?
Well, they certainly represent a key cross-section of that whole post-war policy establishment.
Okay.
And what's particularly striking, I think, is how their shared values. They weren't just, abstract ideas floating around.
Oh, so.
They were actively nurtured in very specific environments. Think prep schools, elite college clubs, the boardrooms of Wall Street.
Right.
And, crucially, those dinner parties in Washington. There's a whole social and intellectual ecosystem, really.
Huh. And it sounds like they weren't just like careerists climbing a ladder. They truly held this vision of public service as a high calling.
That's a big part of it.
Almost with an aversion to the messy bits of partisan politics. Is that fair?
Absolutely. That disdain for partisan bickering was definitely a hallmark.
Yeah.
They much preferred a pragmatic approach.
Realpolitik.
Exactly. Realpolitik over ideology. Sort of a business-like preference for what works for national interest. And they were internationalists. They respected European traditions, and they really saw themselves fighting against that pervasive isolationism still hanging around in America then.
So their vision was shaped by, on the one hand, tradition, but also these emerging threats.
Right.
And I imagine the rise of the Soviet Union as a world power must have profoundly influenced that worldview.
Oh, profoundly. That was central. That, coupled with this almost unabashed belief in America's, sacred destiny,
right,
and maybe their own destiny, to lead the protection of freedom around the globe.
The American century.
Precisely. The spirit Henry Luce captured in that 1941 Life magazine piece. They truly believed it was America's time and their time to lead.
It's fascinating how early life experiences shape us. And for these men, it seems their formative years were more than just personal stories. They were like crucibles, forging the very people who would shape global policy. How deeply did their varied backgrounds truly impact who they became?
Oh, it's huge. You can draw really clear lines. Take Dean Acheson, for instance. He came from a very different world than someone like Harriman.
Okay.
He's had a really difficult time at Groton. Described as, slight, not athletic, independent, cheeky even.
And he endured that hazing thing, right? Pumping.
Yes, this brutal ritual. Dragged from study hall, head first into a lavatory sink, held upside down, water spraying, until he was, retching. Awful.
Wow. That's incredibly visceral. How does something like that connect to the kind of diplomat he became? It must have left a mark.
It absolutely did. That experience, plus his natural independence, it instilled this really unyielding desire to seem tough. To never be seen as a pushover. You see that later, right? Despite his very British, almost dandyish mannerisms, he was never effete, never weak.
So that journey from miserable Groton outcast
to worldly and popular college blade, yeah. It culminated at Yale, getting tapped for a scrolling key.
Which was prestigious, but maybe more fun than Skull and Bones.
Exactly. Less deadly serious, more congenial and convivial. They even allowed liquor. Then at Harvard Law, he had this real intellectual awakening.
Learning from Brandeis.
Yes, learning from Brandeis to be a pragmatist, guided by facts, but also connecting law to social justice. The mix toughness, pragmatism, justice, that's Acheson.
Now, John McCloy's path was totally different, the poor boy from Philadelphia.
Right.
How did Harvard Law function for him? Was it his gateway?
Completely. For McCloy, Harvard Law was his absolute entree into the American establishment he came to, revere.
And what skill did he hone there, or maybe on Wall Street afterwards?
As a Wall Street lawyer, he learned something essential. How to win the complete confidence of powerful men.
Not just legal skill, then.
No. It was about trust, influence, absolutely critical for his later roles in government and beyond.
And then you have Averell Harriman. Born into privilege, sure, but still this compact dynamo. His early career sounds wild.
It really does. He just plunged into the cutthroat market of the robber baron era.
At 20.
Yeah, just 26, takes a $3,000 loan from an uncle, gets a stock exchange seat, and turns it into $150,000, selling short on coal stocks.
Wow. So that kind of high-stakes gambling must have shaped his approach later on.
Definitely. That early taste of risk, reward, bold action, you see it in his diplomacy later. And his marriage, it literally linked him to railroads.
The honeymoon train.
Yeah. Her father, a rail president, gave them a special train with E.H. Harriman painted on the locomotive. Shows his deep ties to big business infrastructure.
Robert Lovett's story is different again. More self-made. Father quit school at 15, Lovett tutored by a priest.
Right. Lovett's background meant he really valued practical learning, resilience, his Yale time, getting into Skull and Bones.
Which was like canonization almost.
Pretty much, yeah. Super prestigious, super secret. That cemented his place in the elite networks, but his background kept him grounded, focused on practical results.
Okay, and finally, George Kennan. His early life seems almost melancholy. Unhappy at military school.
Deeply unhappy at St. John's Military Academy, yeah. Sent there to avoid feminine influence, apparently. He hated the discipline, the loneliness. Wrote these forlorn letters home.
His yearbook entry is amazing. Disposition vacillating, pet peeve of the universe.
Such a lot, right?
Yeah.
His main thing was being class poet. His passion was Chekhov. He even admitted joining the Key and Seal Club at Princeton was just the social thing, despite feeling guilty about the cost.
So that unhappiness, the intellectual focus, the Chekhov, how did that shape him?
It gave him this incredibly nuanced, maybe slightly melancholic understanding of people, of power. And crucially, that immersion in Chekhov gave him, as he put it, no finer grounding in the atmosphere of pre-revolutionary Russia. He's analytical, sensitive, a deep observer. And if we connect all these formative experiences back to the bigger picture, their personal observations, their pragmatic instincts, they were absolutely fundamental in shaping the whole doctrine of Soviet containment.
Right, and this doctrine, as you said, it really reflected their instinct for the pragmatic center. They were trying to strike a balance.
It's exactly a balance between extremes.
What were those extremes they were pushing against?
Well, on one side, you had people they saw as maybe overly optimistic liberal visionaries, folks who thought the Grand Alliance could just continue, make concessions to Stalin, keep the peace.
Okay, and the other side?
The other side were the really fervent anti-communists, viewing it almost as a holy war, an ideological crusade, pure black and white. The wise men sought a middle path.
And it makes sense that Harriman, Kennan, Bohlen, the ones who'd actually been there, seen the Soviet system up close. They became skeptical of post-war cooperation much earlier than others. They had that ground truth.
Precisely. And what's really insightful, I think, is that as pragmatic men, their main worry wasn't necessarily Marxism or communist ideology itself.
Really? Because that's counterintuitive, maybe.
Well, look, they ended up being prime targets of McCarthyism, the red baiting scares. They weren't fanatics. What they fundamentally wanted to contain was the spread of Russian domination, Russian power.
Ah, that's a key distinction. Power versus ideology.
It raises a really interesting question for us looking back. Would they have reacted much the same way if the expansionist empire they faced was still Tsarist Russia, not Bolshevik Russia?
Because the core issue was expansionism, power projection.
That was certainly a huge part of their focus.
Yeah.
Power, stability, national interest.
Okay, we've seen how their background shaped them. Now let's pivot to their direct impact. How did these men actually influence critical events, starting with the atomic bomb and then rebuilding Europe?
Well, Harriman, he grasped the atomic bomb's impact instantly.
How so?
He realized it made the Red Army's help in defeating Japan less necessary. Right away, he started trying to get the State Department thinking about maybe pulling back on asking for Soviet help. The game had changed.
And John McCloy, he was right in the middle of those bomb discussions, wasn't he? Recruited by Stimson to the War Department.
Deep in it. Involved in the top level, talks about S1, the bomb's code name. And he faced some incredibly tough calls.
Like the requests to help Nazi victims.
Exactly. He apparently helped block a plan for the Army to rescue Nazi victims, writing he was very chary of getting the Army involved. And then the request to bomb rail lines to Auschwitz.
What happened there?
He sought advice, and the conclusion was it would be of doubtful efficacy and, crucially, divert forces needed elsewhere. These were agonizing choices with immense moral weight, obviously.
And Dean Acheson on atomic control, he had a different take initially. wanting to share information with the Soviets.
Yeah, when Stimson proposed a plan for U.S.-Soviet atomic arms control, Acheson was strongly on our side, as Stimson put it. Acheson argued there was no alternative to sharing info with Russia, on a quid pro quo basis, mind you, to keep the Grand Alliance from completely fracturing.
But that wasn't the prevailing view.
No. Secretary of State James Burns was adamantly opposed. He thought the Russians only understood power, and this bomb was power.
The bomb in his hip pocket.
That famous phrase, yeah. Burns felt he'd get more tangible results by holding on to the secret.
So a clear disagreement there, and Truman sided with Burns in the end.
Ultimately, yes. Truman decided to take the issue of atomic control to the UN first, rather than approaching Moscow directly like Stimson, Acheson, and Bohlen had recommended. A really pivotal moment.
Okay, shifting gears from the bomb to rebuilding. McCloy seems central to the plans for Germany.
He was very influential there. His early ideas for rebuilding Germany were, perhaps initially, just about helping Germany itself.
But then it got framed differently.
Yeah, later those plans were successfully framed as essential for resisting Soviet expansionism. That gave them much more political traction back home.
What was the core argument he and Stimson made?
They argued that just destroying German industry, punishing them economically, could create an infection, their word, that might kill any hope for democracy in Europe. They saw the bigger picture.
So it wasn't just Germany, it was about European stability as a whole.
Precisely. They pushed for a completely coordinated plan for the economic rehabilitation of Europe as a whole. Their logic was simple. Distress conditions breed revolution.
Whereas economic stability ensures peace.
Exactly. An economically stable Europe assures peace. McCloy even later claimed his efforts made unthinkable another European civil war. A huge claim, but it shows their ambition.
Okay, so the early Cold War heats up. You have immense public anxiety, flashpoints like Korea, the rise of McCarthyism. How did these wise men navigate that turbulence? Starting with Korea.
Yeah, Korea was a huge test. Acheson, initially, he actually supported MacArthur's really daring landing at Incheon.
But that support didn't last.
No, pretty quickly he and Harriman developed serious qualms about MacArthur pushing north towards the Chinese border. Harriman, especially with his Soviet experience, worried it would provoke China.
And those fears turned out to be spot on.
Tragically, yes. When 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the border, General Marshall apparently admitted he had no answer. A moment of absolute crisis.
How did the wise men react in that chaos?
Well, Acheson, even though he was reportedly exhausted, just declared, "We must find a line we can hold and hold it." He feared a world war but was dead set against just pulling out.
And Lovett.
Lovett was apparently reading MacArthur's cables with pure contempt. Said MacArthur was just issuing posterity papers to cover his mistakes and was basically scared.
And Bohlen.
Bohlen, watching from Paris, had a blunter take. MacArthur got caught with his pants down. He urged Kennan to get to Washington immediately to advise Acheson. You feel the urgency, the pressure.
And alongside this war, you have McCarthyism raging at home, a period of intense fear. It seems the wise men, despite being architects of containment, became targets themselves.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the great ironies. Acheson, for example, privately thought McCarthy was a pathological liar. But he refused to publicly engage, maybe didn't want to dignify the attacks.
But it took a personal toll.
His wife, Alice, later said the constant barrage, the attack of the primitives, took 10 years off his life. It was deeply personally damaging.
Hard to imagine facing accusations of disloyalty after such service. Bohlen and Kennan faced similar things.
Horrible stuff. Bohlen had accusations swirling about his loyalty, even his personal life, in his security file. Kennan felt compelled to write to his own sister refuting claims that were being seriously suggested, claims that filled him with horror and foreboding.
It shows how poisonous that atmosphere was.
Absolutely. And later, you see the consequences. John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State, distrusted Kennan. He essentially sidelined him, saying he could find nothing at all to do for the country's leading Soviet expert, ideology trumping expertise.
As the Cold War evolved, the challenges shifted. How did these figures, now elder statesmen in some ways, engage with crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis and, of course, Vietnam?
The Cuban Missile Crisis, that was maybe the ultimate test of their kind of experience.
Yeah.
Kennedy brought in his Soviet experts, Bohlen included.
And what was Bohlen's specific role on the XCOM, the decision-making group?
His job was absolutely crucial. Assess the likely Soviet reaction to any American move. He gave that stark warning, killing Soviet civilians in an attack would be the most dangerous of all things, because it would force the Kremlin to respond, maybe triggering, in his words, a spasm of nuclear fury. He argued strongly against a surprise airstrike, pushing for diplomatic channels instead.
A really critical voice for caution there. Now, Dean Acheson on Vietnam, his views seem to evolve quite significantly over time.
It really did. Initially, back in July '65, he took a pretty hard line, wrote that Hanoi wouldn't negotiate until they were convinced that they cannot win the war. Very firm.
But that changed.
By February '68, he hit a turning point. He basically decided he needed to understand all the facts or he couldn't keep supporting the war effort.
And that led to a shift.
Yes. By March '68, at another meeting of this informal group of wise men advising President Johnson, Acheson voiced the new majority view. He said, essentially, we can no longer do the job we set out to do in the time we have left, and we must take steps to disengage. A major reversal.
Averell Harriman, meanwhile, seemed to be leaning towards diplomacy on Vietnam much earlier. He was described as being at the opposite pole to Acheson's initial hardline.
Harriman was always looking for the diplomatic angle of the deal. He really believed the West could deal with the Soviets. He was fascinated when Khrushchev said, "We will bury you."
But he didn't take it as a literal threat.
No, he understood it meant communism would economically outlast capitalism, not that they bombed the West. That belief in negotiation was key. Defense Secretary McNamara, realizing the war was unwinnable militarily, actually urged Harriman to go to Moscow.
And Harriman suggested a bombing halt?
Yeah, he suggested a total bombing halt by the U.S., conditional on North Vietnam, reducing the fighting. He called it the same ploy that had worked during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Always the fixer, looking for leverage.
And George Kennan, the intellectual dissenter, he eventually spoke out publicly on Vietnam.
He did. He broke his public silence in February 1966 when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee called him to testify.
On national television.
Yes, nationally televised hearings. He called the administration's policy unfortunate. He argued Vietnam just wasn't of vital enough interest to justify American combat troops.
What did he advocate for?
He called for the U.S. to basically liquidate the involvement just as soon as this can be done. It was a very clear, very public dissent, took real courage.
So we've traced their journeys through these massive historical events. Looking back at them as individuals, what really stands out about their unique strengths, their contrasting styles?
It's a fascinating mix of talents, isn't it? You take John McCloy, he's a perfect example of how sometimes those who administer a policy often have more impact than those who conceive it.
The implementer.
Exactly. And after his government service, think about it, he becomes chairman of Chase Bank, general counsel to the Seven Sisters, the big oil companies.
Wow. And he was pretty blunt about that role.
Oh, yeah. Said his job was basically to keep them out of jail. He moved seamlessly between public service and private power.
Blending those concerns.
Totally. He argued to President Kennedy that OPEC was a national security threat because it threatened cheap oil, and that the big oil companies needed antitrust protection to band together against OPEC. Public, private, it was all intertwined for him.
Robert Lovett, on the other hand, sounds like the forward thinker, the strategist almost.
Very much so. His great strength was to look ahead, to prepare for the next war while the generals were still ready to fight the last one.
Like pushing for bombers when others wanted battleships?
Precisely. During World War II, he pushed for bombers. Later, he pushed for missiles when the Pentagon was still focused on bombers because he saw the Soviets were building powerful rockets, always looking over the horizon.
And Harriman, the ultimate fixer, the businessman in the room.
That's a good way to put it. Harriman saw history as basically the actions of great men, and his business was to be in those rooms where the decisions happened.
More tactics than grand strategy.
Yeah, he saw himself more as a fixer than a strategist. Not necessarily deeply reflective, but incredibly effective. Even Kennan said he knew literally no one in the U.S. better acquainted with the global environment. High praise.
Then there's Kennan himself, the thinker, not a warrior. His skepticism of military force seems central.
Absolutely central. He deeply mistrusted the ability of American leaders to use military force wisely, sparingly. His essential elitism, you could call it.
His what?
His sort of disdain for government, driven by mass opinion, by popular passions. It made him exceedingly leery of the emotional anti-communism that was hardening policy. He wanted rational, expert-led decisions.
And finally, Dean Acheson, the meticulous craftsman. What defined him?
Precision. Whether it was law or logic, he was meticulous.
Right.
But also a very private man, didn't like small talk, didn't like travel much, preferred a good book.
But he had a witty side, too, the limericks.
Yeah. Apparently wrote ribald limericks during boring international meetings. But beneath that, fierce loyalty. That image of him waiting alone on the dark train platform for Truman after the '48 election.
Says a lot.
It really does. Solitary, steadfast loyalty. So when you look at the whole arc from those elite schools and early experiences through shaping post-war Germany, containing the Soviets, navigating Korea, Vietnam, these 6 men, they really embody this incredible chapter in American foreign policy. You can really trace how their personal lives, their beliefs, directly influenced these huge decisions that frankly still resonate today.
Absolutely. And what stands out to me thinking about it all is just the sheer weight of responsibility they carried, making calls with truly global consequences. And you see this constant tension in their stories, don't you? Between their own strong convictions, sometimes challenging the status quo, and that collective responsibility you have to bear in moments of just immense global uncertainty.
It leaves you with a pretty profound question, I think.
Yeah.
Especially for today. Where does that kind of wisdom come from? What truly defines a wise decision when the stakes are that incredibly high?
Yeah.
And how do leaders now balance their own insights, their gut feelings, with the enormous pressures of the modern world? It's definitely something for all of us to think about.